The morning Frank Whitfield rode into Calico Flats, the dust rose up around his horse like the land itself was warning him to turn back. He had not wanted to come. That much was certain in the set of his jaw, and the way his eyes kept sliding toward the horizon as though measuring the distance back to Kansas City, back to the surveying office where he had built a quiet, respectable life behind a drafting table, away from anything that reminded him of his father. But the letter from the county clerk had arrived 3 weeks ago, and it had been specific enough in its legal language to shake him out of his comfortable refusal. The land was his. 40 acres in the territory of New Mexico, deeded to one Harold Whitfield in 1874, and passed by law to his only surviving son upon death. The clerk had been polite but firm. Frank needed to come in person to settle the matter, sign the papers, and determine what to do with a property he had never once set eyes on. He had ridden 3 days to get here, and everything about Calico Flats told him he was further from Kansas City than mere distance could explain. The town was small but alive, the kind of alive that frontier settlements carried in their bones, a general store with barrels of feed on the porch, a blacksmith working iron at 7 in the morning, a saloon that appeared open already, and a small church painted white at the end of the main street that seemed to hold itself apart from all the rest. A few men watched him from the shade of the store's overhang. A woman in a sunbonnet crossed the street without looking up. 2 boys ran between buildings, with a hound dog at their heels. Frank pulled his horse to a stop in front of the livery stable and dismounted with the stiffness of a man who spent his working days seated and his riding days suffering for it. He was 31 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with dark brown hair that had grown a little long during the journey and a jaw that had not met a razor since he left Missouri. He handed his horse to the stable boy and asked where he might find the county land office. The boy pointed down the street without a word. The land clerk was a thin man named Orrin Caldwell who wore spectacles on the end of his nose and spoke with the slow deliberateness of someone who had learned that people in legal matters required patience. He confirmed everything the letter had stated. Harold Whitfield had purchased 40 acres northeast of town in 1874, and Harold Whitfield had died in April of 1885 without a will beyond what the state recognized as default inheritance. The land passed to Frank. "There is, however, a complication," Orrin said, and Frank had expected that. He waited. "A woman by the name of Bessie Brenner has been working that land for approximately 10 years. She arrived shortly after your father stopped paying attention to the property, though your father knew of her presence and by all accounts had no objection to it during his lifetime. She has built a house on the land, planted crops, dug a well, and run a small cattle operation. She pays no formal rent because there was never a formal arrangement made. Legally, the land is yours, but practically speaking, it is very much hers." Frank absorbed that for a moment. "And she knows I am coming." "Word travels in a town this size," Orrin said. "She knows." He signed the initial papers to confirm his identity and his claim, then rode out northeast of town following the directions Orrin gave him. The land opened up as he left the town behind, stretching wide and golden in the morning light, broken by juniper and scrub oak, and the red rock formations that rose in the distance like the ruins of something ancient and enormous. The sky was the particular blue of October in New Mexico, deep and clear and almost aggressive in its brightness. He found the property by the fence line, which was solid cedar post and wire, and clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. He followed it along the road until he reached a gate, and beyond the gate he could see a house, not a claim shack, not a dugout, but a real house with a porch and a garden alongside it, and a barn set back 50 yards with its doors open. There were chickens in a yard, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the season with neat rows of turned earth, and a woman standing on the porch with her arms crossed and her eyes already on him. That was the first time Frank Whitfield saw Bessie Brenner, and he would remember the sight of her for the rest of his life. She was 29 years old, though he did not know that yet. She was tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair pulled back from her face and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen hard weather. Her dress was practical cotton, faded blue, and there was nothing about her posture that suggested she intended to be pleasant about this. She watched him open the gate and ride through, watched him tie his horse at the post near the porch steps, and she did not come down to meet him. She held her ground on that porch as though it were a matter of principle. "You are Frank Whitfield," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. He took off his hat the way his mother had raised him to do when addressing a woman, and he looked up at her squarely. "And you are Bessie Brenner." "I am." She tilted her chin up slightly. "You have come for the land." "I have come to settle the matter of it," he said carefully. "I have not decided anything yet." Something shifted in her expression, not softened exactly, but adjusted. She had clearly prepared herself for a harder opening than that. After a beat she said, "You had better come up on the porch then," and she turned and went to the two rocking chairs that sat there and took one, leaving the other for him. He climbed the steps and sat down, and for a moment neither of them spoke. From the porch he could see the full sweep of the property, the fields dormant for winter but clearly well kept, the fence lines running straight and true, a windmill turning slowly near the well, a second small structure that looked like a root cellar or a smokehouse. Whoever had worked this land had worked it well. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since 1875, she said. 10 years come spring. And my father knew." "Your father rode out here in 1876, she said. "Once. I was 20 years old and I had already put in a crop and built the house and sunk the well. I thought he had come to throw me off. Instead, he sat right where you are sitting and he drank a cup of coffee and he said he had no use for the land himself and that as long as I worked it honestly he had no objection. He never came back." Frank looked out at the fields. "He never mentioned it to me, never mentioned you." "Your father and you were not close," she said, and it was not a question either. Frank turned to look at her. "How do you know that?" "Because men who are close to their fathers do not look the way you look when you say the word father," she said plainly, and then she looked away as though she had said more than she intended. He found he did not have an answer to that. He put his hat back on and leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. "I'm not here to take your land, Miss Brenner. I want you to know that first." She looked back at him then, and the look was complicated relief fighting with distrust, the way a person who has been prepared for the worst does not quite know how to receive something that is not the worst. "Then what are you here for?" she asked. "To understand what I have inherited," he said, "and to figure out what the right thing to do with it is." She considered him for a long moment. Then she stood. "I will show you the property," she said. "If you are going to make a decision, you ought to make it knowing what you are deciding about." He stood too. "I would appreciate that." They spent the morning walking the land. She walked the way she talked, directly and without wasted motion, and she narrated the property with the authority of someone who had earned every inch of it through labor. She showed him where she had expanded the original fence line, showed him the well she had dug herself with the help of 2 men from town she had paid in grain, showed him the root cellar built into the hillside with its stores of canned goods and dried meat and root vegetables enough to last the winter comfortably. She showed him the 6 cattle she ran in the back pasture, hardy mixed-breed animals that had survived 3 New Mexico winters without much coddling. She showed him the plot she used for wheat, and the smaller one she used for corn, and the garden rows that in summer produced enough vegetables to eat fresh and put up for the cold months besides. Frank Whitfield had grown up on the edge of rural Missouri before his father's chaos had pushed him towards cities and steady work and things that did not depend on weather or seasons. He recognized good land management when he saw it. This was very good land management. "You do all of this yourself?" he asked when they were standing at the far east fence line. "I have helped during harvest," she said. "A man named Diego comes from town with his son. We have an arrangement. I help with his kitchen garden in spring and he helps with my harvest in fall." She paused. "And there are neighbors I trade work with when something is too large for one person. But day to day myself." He looked at her across the fence post between them. There was a smear of dirt on her left cheek from where she had pushed her hat back and then set it forward again, and her hands when she gestured were calloused and capable. She was, he thought, the most self-sufficient person he had ever encountered, and he had encountered a considerable number of people in his 31 years. "What happened to your family?" he asked, and then immediately said, "Forgive me. That is not my business." "My father brought us west from Ohio in 1872, she said, and she did not appear to take offense at the question. She seemed to have decided to answer him honestly or not at all, and honesty was winning. He had land fever the way some men did. He believed there was something out here that was worth everything it cost. We made it as far as New Mexico before his wagon lost a wheel on a bad river crossing, and he broke both his legs. He died of the infection 3 weeks later. She said it the way people say things they have had a long time to make peace with without drama but without pretense either. My mother had gone back to Ohio the year before. She did not have the constitution for it. My brother went with her. I had just turned 19. I had nowhere to go back to, and I did not want to go back anyway. So you stayed. I found this land," she said. "It was empty and no one was using it, and I was not interested in waiting for someone to tell me I could have it. I built what you see." Frank said nothing for a moment. He looked out at the spread of land in the midday October sun, the yellow grasses and the red dirt and the mountains in the distance turning purple in the haze. "You built something remarkable," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and for the first time there was something unguarded in her face. It passed quickly. "I built what I needed," she said. They walked back to the house in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She made coffee on the wood stove, and he sat at the kitchen table, a solid, hand-built table of ponderosa pine, and looked around the house she had made. It was spare and clean, as practical inside as the land outside, but there were things that made it human. A quilt on the rocking chair by the window, a shelf of books above the fireplace, a small painting of Ohio hills tacked to the wall above the washstand that he suspected she had brought with her from the old life. "I need to stay in Calico Flats for a few days," he said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup, "to settle things with the land office and sort through the papers. Whatever I decide about this property, it will not be decided today." She set a cup of coffee for herself on the table and sat down across from him. "Where will you stay?" There appeared to be a boarding house near the general store. "Mrs. Hanratty's," she said. "It is clean and the food is good. She charges a fair rate." She paused. "You are welcome to ride out here while you are in town if you want to know more about the property." He met her eyes. They were green, he noticed, a deep clear green that matched nothing else in this brown and gold landscape, which made them somehow more striking. "I would like that," he said, "if it is not an imposition." "I have been managing an imposition for 10 years, she said, and there was a dry humor in it that surprised him enough to make him almost smile. He rode back to town in the late afternoon with considerably more to think about than he had arrived with that morning. He settled into Mrs. Hanratty's boarding house, ate a decent supper of roasted chicken and cornbread, and lay in the small, clean bed staring at the ceiling while the wind came off the mountains and rattled the window glass. He thought about the 40 acres and the straight fence lines and the root cellar and the 6 cattle in the back pasture. He thought about his father, Harold Whitfield, who had ridden out to that property once in 1876 and sat in the rocking chair and drank coffee, and decided not to interfere with a 20-year-old woman who was building something from nothing. It was, Frank thought, possibly the most decent thing his father had ever done, and Harold Whitfield had not been a notably decent man. He thought about the green eyes and the calloused hands and the painting of Ohio hills on the wall, and he told himself that was not relevant to any decision he needed to make. He went back the next morning. She was in the barn when he arrived, mending a piece of harness leather with an awl and a length of good thread. She looked up when he came through the barn door and nodded at him as though she had expected him and went back to her work. He found himself a place to sit on a hay bale and watched her work. "You studied surveying," she said without looking up. "I did, in St. Louis before Kansas City. And you survey for a living. I draw survey maps, he said. I work for an engineering firm. We do railroad route surveys mostly, some county land surveys, some municipal planning. She made a small sound that might have been a comment on the railroads. He had heard the feelings frontier people had about the railroads, the land grants, the displacement, the way the lines cut through country that had belonged to other people before it belonged to anyone in a land office. He did not argue with the small sound. "What will you do with the land?" she asked. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "I never wanted to come here. I had no interest in anything my father left behind." She looked up from the harness. And now, he thought about the answer. Outside the barn, one of the cattle lowed softly. The wind moved through the gaps in the barn boards and brought in the smell of cold air and dry grass. "Now I am less certain," he said. They spent the afternoon together without planning to. She had a fence section to repair at the north pasture and he offered to help, and she accepted the offer without making a production of it, just handed him a post driver and showed him what needed doing. They worked through the afternoon in a comfortable working silence broken by practical exchanges, and when the sun started to drop behind the mountains, she looked at the work they had done together and said, "Stay for supper." It was more command than invitation. He stayed. She made a venison stew with dried beans and root vegetables from the cellar, and they ate at the ponderosa pine table with the last light fading through the kitchen window. She asked him about Kansas City, not with the wistfulness of someone wanting to be somewhere else, but with the curiosity of someone who has chosen their life deliberately and wants to understand the lives other people have chosen. He told her about the office and the drafting tables, and the precise, quiet satisfaction of turning a surveyed landscape into a clean, drawn map. He told her about the city, the noise and the streets and the way buildings went up one year and came down the next, the constant reconfiguration of a place that had not yet made up its mind what it wanted to be. "Do you like it?" she asked. He thought about that longer than he expected to. "I am comfortable there," he said finally. She tilted her head slightly. "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She refilled his coffee and they sat for a while longer. And when the night had fully come down and the coyotes started their distant conversation with each other, he stood and said he ought to get back to town. She walked him to the porch and stood in the lamplight that fell through the open door while he untied his horse. "Same time tomorrow," she said, and there was something almost careful about it, as though she were asking more than the surface of the words. He put his boot in the stirrup and settled into the saddle and looked down at her. The lamplight caught the red in her hair. "Same time tomorrow," he said. He rode back to Calico Flats in the dark and the cold and the wide silence of the territory. And the star field overhead was so dense and bright it seemed like something that ought to have a sound. He had grown up near enough to the frontier to know that sky, but had spent enough years in cities to have half forgotten it, and it hit him with a strange force, the hugeness of it, the indifference of it, and somewhere underneath that, a feeling he had no immediate name for. By the third day, Orrin Caldwell was mildly impatient. "The papers are ready for your signature whenever you decide," he said, when Frank stopped in at the land office. "I am still deciding," Frank said. Orrin gave him the look of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and was not surprised by it. "The property is yours to do with as you wish. You could sell it. You could continue allowing Miss Brenner to work it. You could assert your ownership formally and set terms for tenancy. You could deed it outright to someone else. Those are your options under the law." "I know my options," Frank said. "Of course you do," Orrin said and went back to his papers. Frank went back to the boarding house and sat in the small chair by the window and thought. He was a practical man. He had made his way in the world through practicality, through clear-eyed assessment of situations and logical resolution of problems. The situation was clear enough. A woman had worked land that legally belonged to someone else for 10 years, had transformed it from raw, unused territory into a functioning farm with a house and a well and a barn and cattle, and that someone else had now arrived. The logical resolution was equally clear: sign the land over to her. Deed it to Bessie Brenner, who had earned it 10 times over, and ride back to Kansas City. That was the right thing to do. He went back out to the property on the third afternoon and found her splitting wood behind the barn. She had a good rhythm to it, the axe rising and falling with the economy of someone who had been doing it long enough to stop wasting motion. He watched her from a small distance before she noticed him, not in a manner he felt comfortable thinking too carefully about, just watching the way a person watches someone who moves with that kind of natural competence. She set the axe in the block and pushed her hat back and looked at him. There was color in her cheeks from the exertion and the cold. "You have made a decision," she said, reading something in his face. "I have," he said. She waited. He could see her composing herself, setting her expression into something neutral and prepared, and it struck him that she had likely been bracing for this since the moment she heard he was coming. 10 years of work, and she had been carrying the weight of this uncertainty for weeks. "I am going to deed the land to you," he said. He watched her face process that, watched the preparation for bad news encounter good news and falter, and then something broke open in her expression that she did not quite manage to hide in time. It was not tears. Bessie Brenner did not appear to be a woman who cried easily, but it was something profound and unguarded, a relief so large it had almost the character of grief, the way very large feelings sometimes do when they have been held in a long time. "I see," she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. "You have built this place," he said. "You have worked it and improved it and made it what it is. My father left it idle and you gave it life. Whatever the law says about ownership, the honest claim on this land is yours." He paused. "I will have Orrin draw up the deed transfer. It will be clean and legal. No one can come after you for it." She turned away from him and pressed both hands flat against the side of the barn. He could see her shoulders rise and fall with a long breath. When she turned back, her face was composed again, but her eyes were very bright. "Why?" she asked. He was honest. "Because it is right," he said, "and because my father apparently knew that too, even if he never formalized it. And because I am a surveyor. I understand what a piece of land represents to the person who has worked it." He stopped himself from saying more, from saying that there were other reasons taking shape in him that he was not ready to examine in the daylight. She stepped forward and offered him her hand, the gesture of a person who conducted their serious business on those terms, and he took it and shook it. Her grip was firm and warm and lasted a beat longer than strictly required. "Thank you, Frank Whitfield," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. That night he did not go back to Mrs. Hanratty's. She asked him to stay for supper again, and supper turned into sitting by the fireplace with the wind picking up outside, and the fire making its warm movements of light and shadow on the walls. She brought out a bottle of whiskey she kept in the cupboard for the cold months, and poured 2 small glasses and handed him one, and they sat in the 2 chairs by the fire and drank and talked. And the talking went deep into the evening in a way that neither of them had planned for. She told him about the first winter, 1875, when she had been 20 years old and alone on 40 acres in New Mexico with 2 blankets and a cooking pot, and a determination she had not yet had occasion to question. How the temperature had dropped to nothing and her water barrel had frozen solid, and she had spent 3 days chipping ice off the surface of a creek half a mile away, and carrying it back in buckets. How she had survived on dried beans and the small game she had taught herself to trap, because her father had always done the hunting, and she had watched carefully enough to approximate his knowledge when she needed to. "I was frightened every single night for that first winter," she said, looking into the fire. "I do not think I admitted that to anyone before now. During the days I was too busy to be frightened. At night I was terrified." She paused. "But I was also more alive than I have been at any other time, and I think that is what kept me here when a sensible person would have gone back east." Frank looked at her profile in the firelight. "You were never going to go back east," he said. She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face considerably. "No," she said, "I was never going to go back east." He told her about his father. "Not all of it. There was too much, and some of it had no clean narrative form, but enough. Harold Whitfield had been a man of grand ambitions and narrow execution, full of plans that dissolved before completion, full of enthusiasms that left damage in their wake. He had bought the New Mexico land in 1874 because he had a vision of moving west and starting fresh, and he had never gone because the next enthusiasm arrived before he could act on the previous one. He had left Frank's mother when Frank was 12 and his sister was 8, left them in a house in Missouri with a small amount of money and a large amount of bills and the neighborhood's collective embarrassment. Frank had become practical out of necessity. He had surveyed his own life the same way he surveyed land, measuring, calculating, finding the firm ground and staying on it. He was not a cruel man, Frank said, surprising himself with the accuracy of it even now. He was a careless one, which in the end does almost as much damage. Bessie was quiet for a moment. He did one good thing, she said. He left this land and then he left it alone. Yes, Frank said. He did. They sat with the fire burning down and the wind outside and the comfortable weight of having said true things to each other, and at some point Bessie reached over and set her hand on his arm, a brief warm touch of acknowledgement, and then took it away. He felt the absence of it like a small cold. He rode back to town very late and slept the deepest sleep he had managed in weeks. The next morning he was at the land office when it opened, and he told Orrin to prepare the deed transfer. Orrin did not look surprised. He noted down the details and said the papers would be ready in 2 days, and Frank went to find something useful to do with himself while he waited. He found it at the general store, where a conversation with the owner, a broad, cheerful man named Thomas Hale, revealed that the property northeast of town had been the subject of some interest recently. A land speculator named Garland Pruitt had arrived in Calico Flats 2 weeks ago and had been making inquiries about available land in the area. He had visited the land office. He had apparently taken note of the Whitfield parcel. "He is a type we have seen before," Thomas said, with the mild disgust of a man who had watched this kind of thing play out more than once. "Comes in, buys up land that someone else has improved, turns them off it, sits on it until the railroad comes through or a town expands and then sells at a profit. He has been doing it all over the territory for 3 years. Frank was quiet for a moment. Miss Brenner's property, Thomas met his eyes. He was asking who held the title and whether the heir had been located. That was before you arrived. He knows I am here now. News like that does not stay quiet. Frank thanked Thomas and left the store and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, thinking. The deed transfer would take 2 days. In those 2 days, Garland Pruitt was aware that the legal title was still in Frank's name, and that Frank was a man who had just arrived from Kansas City and might, under sufficient pressure or a sufficiently attractive offer, be persuaded to sell. He would not be persuaded. That was not a question in his mind. But he wanted to talk to Bessie about it before Pruitt had an opportunity to talk to anyone else. He rode out to the property that afternoon to find her checking on the cattle in the back pasture. He told her what Thomas Hale had said, watching her face as he said it. Her expression went very still. "I know about Pruitt," she said. "He came out here a week ago before you arrived. He told me that the title would likely be claimed and that the new owner would almost certainly want to sell. He offered to serve as an intermediary." "What did you say?" "I told him to get off my land," she said. She paused. "His land, the land that was not yet determined. I told him to leave." Frank felt something that was more than just satisfaction at that answer. The deed transfer will be complete in 2 days. Once that is recorded at the land office, you are the owner of record and there is nothing Pruitt or anyone else can do about it. She looked at him steadily. "And if he approaches you before then, if he offers to buy, then I will tell him the property is not for sale," Frank said, "because I have already committed to transferring it to its rightful owner." She turned back to the cattle for a moment, and he could see her processing that, filing it into whatever categories she kept for things people said and whether to believe them. 2 days, she said finally. 2 days, he confirmed. Garland Prout found Frank that evening, as Frank had expected he would. He was waiting in the chair outside Mrs. Hanratty's boarding house when Frank returned from supper, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s, with a soft face that had the particular smoothness of someone who did not do physical work and ate well regardless. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and the practiced warmth of a man who had made a career out of first impressions. "I understand you are here to settle your father's estate," Prout said. "A difficult business." "The property northeast of town. I have been doing some research on it. I believe I can offer you a fair price that would make the whole matter considerably simpler than trying to work something out with the current occupant." Frank let him finish. It was a good pitch, smooth and reasonable, with numbers attached that would have been interesting to a man who had come out here without a prior commitment. "I appreciate the offer," Frank said, "but I have already made a prior arrangement for the property. It is not available." Prout's pleasant expression did not change, but his eyes adjusted. "I see. The arrangement with Miss Brenner, I take it." "That is a private matter," Frank said, "but the property is not for sale. I am sorry you have wasted your time." Prout was quiet for a beat, then smiled in the way people smile when they are recalculating. "If you change your mind," he said, and let it hang there. "I will not," Frank said. Prout nodded pleasantly enough and walked away down the boardwalk, and Frank watched him go and felt a clean, quiet satisfaction that had nothing complicated in it. He went upstairs and slept well again. The next day he spent more time at the property, and neither he nor Bessie mentioned Prout again. They had moved past it. He helped her haul wood from a pile she had cut earlier in the season, stacking it against the south wall of the house, where it would be easy to access through the winter months. It was hard work, and he was not as practiced at it as she was, and she did not pretend otherwise, but she also did not make him feel the lack. She simply worked alongside him and matched his pace to what he could manage without saying a word about it. At midday she made lunch at the kitchen table, cold venison and bread she had baked that morning and a pot of coffee, and they ate in a companionable quiet that had developed so naturally over the past few days that Frank no longer noticed it as a distinct thing. It was just the ordinary texture of time spent with someone. "When will you go back to Kansas City?" she asked, not looking up from her plate. He had been wondering when she would ask. "Once the deed is recorded," he said. "I have no reason to stay after that." She nodded, still not looking up. "Of course. The office expects me back by end of month," he said, which was true. And then, because it was also true, he said, "I have been thinking, however, that there may be survey work available in the territory. The county has been growing. The land office told me they are behind on updated property surveys. A man with my skills could find steady work here if he wanted to." She looked up then. "If he wanted to," he repeated. The green eyes considered him with a careful attention. "Are you saying you want to?" she said. He set down his coffee cup and met her gaze directly, which was the only way he knew how to say anything important. "I am saying that I came here expecting to settle a piece of business and leave, and instead I find myself in no particular hurry to go anywhere." The silence between them had weight and warmth and a kind of held breath quality. "That is a complicated thing to say," she said finally. "I am not known for simple," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, not the dry humor of the first day, but something fuller and more surprised, and it landed in his chest like something that had been missing. "You can survey land from anywhere," she said. "I can," he said. "The county here is in need of it as it happens. I spoke to Orrin about it. He said the commissioner has been asking about it for 2 years. That would be a thing to consider seriously," she said, and her voice was careful and deliberate in a way that meant she was making space for it without pushing him into it, which was, he thought, exactly the right thing to do. "I am considering it seriously," he said. They sat with that between them, warm and unresolved, and neither of them moved to resolve it too quickly, because some things deserve the space they need. The following morning the deed papers were ready. Frank and Bessie rode into town together for the first time, side by side on the morning road with the mountains pink and gold in the early light. They tied their horses outside the land office and went in together, and Orrin Caldwell, who had spent 30 years processing land transactions in this territory and thought he had seen most varieties of human arrangement, looked at the two of them and then looked back at his papers with a carefully neutral expression. Frank signed the deed transfer. Bessie signed the acceptance. Orrin pressed his seal to it and recorded it in the ledger and handed Bessie her copy, and she stood with it in both hands looking at it for a long moment. "It is done," Orrin said. Bessie looked up at Frank. There were 10 years in her face at that moment, 10 years of work and cold winters and the constant low-grade uncertainty of occupying ground that was not legally hers, and all of that releasing at once into something that looked like and was, in fact, simply relief. "Thank you," she said, and she said it with her whole self. "The land was always yours," he said. "I just made the paperwork agree with reality." They walked out into the October morning together, and the town went about its business around them without knowing anything had changed, which was all right. Some of the most significant things happened quietly in the middle of ordinary days. They went to the general store because she needed salt and lamp oil, and Thomas Hale congratulated her on the deed with a handshake and the warm satisfaction of a man who had hoped for this outcome. Several people in the store knew her, nodded to her, asked about the winter stores and the cattle and the condition of the north pasture fence. She moved through these conversations with an ease that told Frank she had built something here that was more than just a farm. She had built belonging, the kind that takes years and shows up in small daily exchanges between people who know each other's business. He watched her from a slight distance and felt the specific quality of admiration that is the opening note of something much larger. When they came out of the store and stood on the boardwalk in the clean, cold morning, she looked at him sideways. "What will you do now, today, I mean?" "I thought I might ride back out to the property," he said, "if the offer of company still stands." "The wood stack needs finishing," she said, as though that settled it. They rode back out under a sky that had gone from pink to deep blue, and Frank thought that he had been in Calico Flats for 5 days, and that the life he had left in Kansas City was beginning to feel like something that belonged to a different arrangement of the world. Over the following week, Frank stayed on at Mrs. Hanratty's boarding house and rode out to the property each morning. He had, with Orrin's introduction, spoken to the county commissioner about the backlog of survey work, and the commissioner had engaged him for an initial contract, 3 parcels northeast of town that needed updated boundary surveys due to a disputed fence line between 2 neighboring properties. It was work he could do and work he was glad to have, and it gave him an official reason to remain in Calico Flats that did not require examining the unofficial reasons. He surveyed during the mornings and helped Bessie with the property in the afternoons, and the afternoons were becoming the center of his days in a way he no longer tried to rationalize. She was teaching him things he had never known: how to read weather from the color of the sky and the behavior of the cattle, how to tell when a fence post was set well enough to last a winter, and when it would need resetting in spring, how to bank a fire properly in a wood stove so it held heat through the night without burning down. He was teaching her things in return, the mathematics of land survey, which she was quick with once she understood the principles, and some of what he knew about legal documentation and property rights in the territory, which he suspected she needed less than she let on but appeared to enjoy discussing. One afternoon they rode the fence line together, checking it before the serious cold came, and the ride took them up into the higher ground northeast of the property, where the land opened into a wide rocky meadow with a view of the mountains that stopped Frank's horse in its tracks without any instruction from him. He had seen this country from a distance and from below, but from this elevation it had an entirely different character, the full sweep of the Sangre de Cristo Range running north to south in the afternoon light, the colors of the high desert gold and rust and deep green juniper, the enormous sky pressing down on all of it. He sat his horse and did not say anything. Bessie stopped beside him and watched him looking at it. She had seen this view 1,000 times. She watched him see it for the first time. "This is why you stayed," he said, "not about her. About the land, the country, the thing her father had come west looking for. Part of why," she said. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the late afternoon light was on her face, and the wind was moving her hair, and there was something in the moment that was large and unhurried and completely clear. "Bessie," he said. "Do not say anything impulsive," she said, but her voice was gentle when she said it. "I do not do impulsive," he said. "I survey things, I measure them. I make sure I know the ground before I put my weight on it." "And," she said. "And I know the ground," he said. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the mountains. Then she said, "You have a life in Kansas City." "I have a job in Kansas City," he said, "which is different." "A man who has a job in Kansas City and comes to settle a piece of inherited property does not usually end up in a meadow deciding to stay," she said. "Usually is not always," he said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, in the way she had looked at the land before she stayed, measuring, calculating, finding the firm ground. He sat still and let her look. "I am not easy to know," she said finally. "I have been alone a long time, and I have gotten set in my ways, and I will not apologize for that. I have been comfortable a long time," he said, "which is its own kind of alone. I will not apologize for that either." She almost smiled. "We are a pair of warnings to each other," she said. "Or a pair of second chances," he said. The wind came through the meadow and moved the dry grass around them, and the horses stood quiet in it, and after a while Bessie said, "You can stay for supper." It was both exactly what it was and considerably more, and they both understood that. He did not go back to Mrs. Hanratty's that night until well after dark, and when he arrived, he was carrying the particular warmth of a man who has spent an evening by someone else's fire and not wanted to leave. He sat on the edge of the bed in the small room and looked at his hands in the lamplight and thought about the geography of his own life, the way he had surveyed it into something safe and bounded and correct, and what it might look like if he redrew the map. He sent a letter to Kansas City the next morning, to his employer at the engineering firm, explaining that he had found survey contract work in New Mexico territory and would need an extension on his leave. He worded it carefully, leaving open the question of whether he was coming back, because he was a man who measured before he committed, and that was his honest position. The letter to his landlord was briefer. Please hold his rooms for another month and he would be in touch. Then he went to find Garland Prout. He found the man at the saloon, which opened at 10 and was doing a reasonable morning business for a Monday. Prout looked up from his drink without surprise, which suggested he had been expecting this visit one way or another. "I want to be clear about something," Frank said, sitting down across from him without invitation. "The Whitfield parcel is deeded to Bessie Brenner as of yesterday morning and recorded at the county land office. There is no transaction to be made, now or in the future, with me or with anyone else who might come here claiming interest in that property. If you make any approach to Miss Brenner about her land, I will be speaking with the county sheriff about the exact nature of your activities in this territory, including the 3 families in Doña Ana County who were displaced from improved land. They had worked for years under circumstances that a judge might find worth examining." He had gotten that information from Thomas Hale, who had been collecting it the way small-town general store owners collected everything useful about everything. He had spent an evening confirming what he could through the land office records. Prout's pleasant face had gone very still. "That is a serious allegation," he said. "It is a documented pattern," Frank said calmly. "I am a surveyor. I work with records for a living. I am very good at reading them." He stood. "Good morning, Mr. Prout." He walked out of the saloon into the bright morning and did not look back. Prout left Calico Flats 2 days later. Thomas Hale told Frank this with considerable satisfaction, and Mrs. Hanratty told Bessie over the fence between their properties when Bessie rode in for more lamp oil, and Bessie came to find Frank at the land office where he was reviewing survey notes to tell him. "You did not tell me you were going to do that," she said. "I thought it better to do it than discuss it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, and it was simpler than the earlier thank you but no less serious. "No one should be able to threaten what you have built," he said. "Not with legal tricks and not with land speculation and not with anything else." She reached out and touched his hand, which was resting on the counter of the land office, and Orrin Caldwell found something very interesting to look at on the far wall. November arrived in Calico Flats with a wind that came down from the mountains carrying the serious cold of the high desert, and Frank Whitfield moved out of Mrs. Hanratty's boarding house and into the small front room of Bessie Brenner's house, which she offered, and he accepted with the mutual understanding that it was a practical arrangement, and that they were both adults who could navigate practical arrangements. He paid her a fair rent that she tried to refuse and he insisted on, because he was not going to take up space in her life without contributing to it, and that was simply who he was. The arrangement required them to be honest about the domestic geography of living in the same house, which turned out to be a natural thing. She cooked in the mornings and he cooked in the evenings. They divided the household work without discussion or fuss, and they spent their evenings by the fire in the 2 rocking chairs that she had moved inside for the winter with the whiskey bottle and the books from the shelf and the comfortable weight of conversation that had become as natural as breathing. He learned her rhythms. She woke before dawn without an alarm, the way farming people do, and was already in the barn by the time the sky lightened. She took her coffee black and could make it stretch further than seemed possible. She read voraciously novels, almanacs, seed catalogs, a year-old newspaper from Santa Fe that she had read so many times the pages were soft. She had opinions about everything she read, delivered with precision and without apology, and he found himself arguing with her purely for the pleasure of it, because she argued well and honestly and never held it against him when he was right, which was not always. She learned his rhythms, too. He worked best in the long afternoons when the light was good for detail work. He was quieter than she had expected from a man who made his living in a city, quieter and more patient with silence. He was handy with tools in the careful way of someone self-taught, which meant he checked his measurements 3 times before acting and never had to undo his work. He missed Kansas City less with each passing week, and she could tell, and she said nothing about it because she was a woman who understood that some things needed to find their own pace. The county survey work expanded. The commissioner was pleased with the first 3 parcels and engaged Frank for 6 more. And the word spread in the way word does in small communities. And he began to receive requests from individual landowners for boundary clarifications, deed verifications, and the small but important legal work of establishing clear land documentation in a region where many old claims had never been properly formalized. He set up a small working space at the table by the window, and his survey instruments lived in a case beside the door, and after 2 weeks it was entirely unclear when he had stopped being a visitor. The first snow came on a Tuesday night in mid-November and fell through the night so that when they woke Wednesday morning the world was white and still, and the mountains had disappeared behind low gray cloud. They stood on the porch together with coffee cups in hand and looked at it, and the ordinary marvel of it was multiplied by being seen together. "First snow I have seen that I was not dreading," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You were not dreading it." "In Kansas City the snow was something to manage," he said. "Streets and ice and the cold getting into the buildings. Here it is." He paused. "Quiet," she said. "Quiet," he agreed. She was standing very close to him on the narrow porch, their shoulders almost touching. The cold air between them was small and growing smaller. He turned to look at her and she was already looking at him, and this time there was nothing held back or measured in what was on her face. And he set his coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to her fully and said, "Bessie." And she said, "I know." And he kissed her in the first snow of November on the porch of the house she had built from nothing, and it was quiet and very right. They stood there for some time in the cold morning light with the snow falling gently around them, and when they finally went inside to get warm, nothing about the house had changed physically, and everything about it had changed in the way that the inside of a room changes when you light a lamp, the same room, newly and completely itself. The weeks that followed were the fullest Frank had experienced since he could not easily recall when. He was working, genuinely working, doing something that mattered and that he was good at, and that had visible daily results. The land held him the way it had apparently held Bessie, not with prettiness or ease, but with a kind of honesty that had no equivalent indoors. When the wind came off the mountains, it meant something. When the cattle needed attention, they needed it. When the fence required work, it required the work now, not scheduled for later. He helped with the cattle through the winter with a growing competence that Bessie acknowledged by gradually including him in decisions she had previously made alone. What to do about the heifer that was showing signs of respiratory trouble, when to rotate the cattle between pastures despite the cold, whether to sell 2 of the steers in town or hold them through winter. He offered opinions carefully at first, then with more confidence as she made clear that she wanted them. They argued about the heifer for 2 days and eventually did what he suggested, and it worked, and she said simply, "You were right," with no difficulty at all. He wrote the letter to his employer in Kansas City in late November. It was not, in the end, a difficult letter to write. He had measured the ground. He knew where he was. He resigned his position at the engineering firm with gratitude and respect, and the explanation that he had found work in New Mexico territory that suited him better. He sent a second letter to his landlord releasing his rooms. He arranged for his remaining possessions, some clothes, his surveying instruments and reference books, a small amount of furniture he had accumulated to be sent by freight to Calico Flats. He did not tell Bessie he had written the letters until they were sent, because he wanted the decision to be fully and only his before it became theirs. When he did tell her on an evening in early December with the fire burning high and the wind outside, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are certain." "I have been certain since the meadow," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked up at him, and her face was fully open in a way he had learned was her most private expression, not the public composure of a woman managing a farm and negotiating with a world that had always expected her to fail, but the quiet, real Bessie that lived underneath all of that, the one she had been growing toward showing him for 2 months. "I do not have much to offer a man," she said. 40 acres and a good root cellar and cattle that can survive a hard winter, a house that I built myself, and that is not exactly refined. "I am not looking for refined," he said. "I am looking for real. This is all there is," she said. "What you have seen." "What I have seen," he said, "is exactly what I want." She came across to him then, from her rocking chair to the edge of the armchair where he sat, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat together in the firelight without needing to say anything more. The box from Kansas City arrived at the general store in mid-December, marked for Frank Whitfield in care of Thomas Hale, and Frank spent an afternoon unpacking it at the kitchen table while Bessie watched with what she tried to present as practical interest, and which was in fact more openly curious than that. His drawing instruments in their fitted wooden case. A small case of surveying reference books, a wool coat that was better quality than anything he had acquired since coming west, a flat envelope of personal items, some letters, a photograph or 2, a small pocket watch that had been his mother's. She picked up the pocket watch and turned it over in her hand. On the back was engraved a small flower, a simple thing, worn smooth with years. "Your mother's," she said. "She gave it to me when I left for school," he said. She said the only Whitfield who ever did anything worth doing was me, and I should keep time carefully. "She sounds like a woman I would have liked," Bessie said. "She would have liked you considerably more than she liked most people," he said. "She had no patience for anything that was not genuine." Bessie set the watch down carefully and met his eyes. "Ask me," she said quietly. He had been thinking about how to do this for 3 weeks. He had not wanted to do it wrongly. He reached into his coat pocket and set on the table a small ring he had made by the jeweler in Calico Flats the previous week. A simple silver band with a small garnet set in it. Nothing extravagant, nothing impractical, which seemed to him to suit everything he knew about her. "I do not have a speech prepared," he said. "You know me well enough to know that a speech would not be me." "I know that," she said. "I came here to settle a piece of business," he said, "and instead I found the first real home I have been in a long time, and I found the person who made it. I want to make it with you. I want to survey this land beside you every season it gives us and build this life beside you for all of it." He picked up the ring. "Bessie Brenner, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and she looked at him, and her face went through several things in quick succession. But what settled on it at the end was the fullness of someone who has stopped waiting for the other shoe to fall and allowed themselves to simply receive what is good. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Frank Whitfield." He put the ring on her finger and she turned her hand over and looked at it. And then she looked at him with that open, private expression. And he kissed her over the ponderosa pine table in the kitchen she had built, in the house she had built, on the land that was hers. They were married in the white church at the end of Calico Flats' Main Street on the last Saturday before Christmas, 1885, with Thomas Hale as witness and his wife Clara as the other, with Orrin Caldwell in a good suit he had clearly pressed specially, with Diego from town and his wife and their son filling the front pews, and with Mrs. Hanreddy weeping cheerfully in the back row, because she had known within 2 days of Frank arriving that something was going to come of his daily rides northeast. The minister, a patient man named Reverend Cooper who had officiated at a considerable range of frontier weddings, and who believed firmly that the important thing was the quality of what was being said, and not the elaborateness of the surrounding, read the ceremony plainly and well. Frank said the words looking directly at Bessie and meaning every syllable. Bessie said the words back with the clear-eyed directness that was entirely her own, and that he had come to understand was her highest form of tenderness. She wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes in a way that made Frank's chest feel briefly insufficient for the purpose of containing his feelings, and she had done her hair differently from the usual practicality, pinned up with small sprigs of dried flowers that Clara Hale had contributed with great enthusiasm. She was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life, which he told her afterward, and which she received with a slight flush and a look of enormous skepticism that he intended to spend a significant number of years overcoming. They had a modest wedding supper at the Hale house that evening, with a table full of good food and good people, and a warmth of fellowship that told Frank everything about the kind of community Bessie had built herself in Calico Flats, the kind that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with years of showing up and being honest and doing the work. These were her people. Now they were his people. He had not had people in a long time and found he had forgotten how much that mattered. They rode home under a winter sky that was dense with stars, their breath making small clouds in the cold, the horses moving easy on the familiar road. The property appeared ahead of them in the darkness, the house with a lamp left burning in the window giving off its warm light, the barn solid against the night sky, the windmill turning slowly in a light wind. "Home," Bessie said, and the word was the fullest version of itself. "Home," Frank agreed. The winter settled in around them deeply after Christmas, and they lived it together with the particular intimacy of two people sharing a small house through long cold nights and short cold days. They read to each other in the evenings. They played cards, which she won consistently with a calm that he suspected was not entirely natural. They had the small domestic negotiations of people building a shared life, who preferred the left side of the bed and who the right. How early was too early to get up and how late too late to stay up. The arrangement of the kitchen that Frank consistently put back incorrectly and that Bessie corrected without irritation, but with a look he came to know meant she had already corrected it 3 times this week. He helped her plan the spring planting season in January, spreading her almanac and seed catalogs across the kitchen table, and working through the rotation with the methodical attention to measurement and detail that was his nature. She knew more about the land than he did, obviously, but he had skills in calculation and planning that complemented her practical knowledge, and the result of their combined approach was a spring plan that was larger and more ambitious than what she had done alone, because she now had the confidence of another capable pair of hands. They also spent those winter evenings planning the survey work for the spring. Frank had contracts for 12 parcels across the county, enough work for the warm season, and he had begun to build a reputation that suggested more would follow. The territory was formalizing. More settlers were arriving every year. The railroad was coming, which would change everything and not all of it for good, but the need for accurate land documentation was only going to increase, and Frank Whitfield was positioned exactly where that need lived. On a quiet evening in February, Bessie sat across the table, with the casualness of someone who has been sitting with a thought for some time. "I have been thinking about the back pasture." He looked up from his survey notes. "The east section is larger than what I need for 6 cattle," she said. "If we expanded the herd to 10 or 12, we could make the operation significantly more productive. There is a rancher east of town, a man named Callahan, who has been running quality stock for 20 years. I have spoken to him about it." She paused. "He would be willing to sell 4 young animals in the spring at a fair price." Frank put down his pencil. "What would it cost?" She told him the number. It was manageable between his survey earnings and her farm proceeds. "What do you think?" she said. He liked that she asked. He liked that she was asking because she wanted his actual opinion and not because she needed his permission, which was a distinction she had never once blurred. "I think we should do it," he said. "And I think we should build a second stall in the barn before spring so we have the room." She smiled across the table at him, the full real smile, the one that had appeared on the 4th day and gotten less rare since. "I was going to suggest the same thing," she said. "We are developing a habit of thinking alike," he said. "We are," she said, and the way she said it suggested she found this considerably more than convenient. Spring came to New Mexico territory slowly, and then all at once. The way it always did, weeks of mud and false warmth, and then one morning the ground was dry and the air had changed character entirely, and everything was happening. The kitchen garden went in first, then the wheat field, then the corn. Frank helped her with all of it and found the physical work of spring planting absorbing in a way that desk work never quite was, the direct, immediate, unambiguous relationship between effort and result. The 4 new cattle came from Callahan's ranch on a warm April morning, driven by Callahan himself and his grown son. And they were as good as advertised, healthy, solid animals that settled into the expanded pasture without significant drama. Frank and Callahan shook hands over the fence, and Callahan said something to him in a low voice about how the northeast property had been running better since last fall, and his expression was clearly approving. And Frank came back inside feeling something he identified after some reflection as pride. The spring survey season was full and good. He covered the county on horseback over a series of weeks, sometimes with a young man from town named William who was quick with the survey rod and eager to learn the work. And the maps he produced were clean and accurate, and the kind of thing that would serve the people of the county reliably for years. He came home in the evenings covered in the honest dust of the territory, and Bessie had supper going and the horses watered, and the exchange of their days over the kitchen table was something he held privately as among the better things he had encountered in 31 years of life. Diego and his son came in June for the beginning of the season work, and the farm was larger in operation now, and the harvest would be larger too, and the work expanded to match. Frank had become a recognizable figure in the daily rhythms of the property by now, and Diego treated him as such, which was the kind of acceptance that is extended to people who show up and work and do not make themselves difficult, which was all Frank had ever tried to do. In June, he received a letter from his sister in Missouri. She had heard from a mutual acquaintance about the marriage, and she was, by her own description, astonished in the best possible way. He wrote her back at length, and with a warmth that surprised him somewhat, having not been close with her as adults in the way their shared childhood upheaval had unfortunately made difficult. He described Bessie with precision because he did not know how to describe her with anything else, her capability and her directness, and the way she had built a life from nothing, and the way she held her ground on everything that mattered, and the way she had led him into that life with a generosity that he suspected she had not fully expected of herself. He told his sister she was welcome to come visit, and meant it. On a July evening that was warm and still, with the last light going orange over the mountains and the horses in the pasture and the smell of the kitchen garden coming through the open window, Bessie came and found him on the porch where he was cleaning a survey instrument, and sat down beside him and said, with the same casual calm she used for proposing an expansion of the cattle herd, "I believe there is going to be a baby." Frank set down the instrument very carefully. He turned to look at her. She was watching the mountains with the particular expression of someone who has been sitting with very large news for some days before saying it. "When?" he said. "Late winter," she said. "February, I think." He reached over and took her hand, which she allowed, and they sat for a while with the evening coming down around them and the particular weight of a future arriving, not a possibility now but an actual being in the actual world, growing in the warm certainty of this life they had made. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "I have never been frightened of things I can work toward." She paused. "This is a thing I can work toward." "We will work toward it together," he said. She squeezed his hand and did not let go for a long time. She told him the next morning that she had already spoken to the midwife in town, a capable woman named Ruth Garza, who had been delivering babies in Calico Flats and the surrounding area for 15 years, and that Ruth had confirmed the pregnancy and given her a clean bill of health and a list of reasonable precautions for the summer months. This was very Bessie, he thought. She had handled the practical arrangements before telling him, not to exclude him, but because managing the practical was how she expressed care for herself and for the people around her. He did not take it as anything other than what it was, which was her particular form of love in motion. The summer passed in its fullness. The wheat came up strong and the corn was good and the cattle multiplied, because 2 of the cows had calves in late summer, which Bessie had anticipated and Frank had found both startling and wonderful. Diego and his son helped with the harvest in August and September, and the root cellar filled with the season's abundance, and the barn was stacked with feed, and there was a real satisfaction in the visible result of a year's work around them. Frank finished his spring and summer survey contracts and accepted the commissioner's offer of an ongoing county contract for the following year. He was, by now, the county's primary surveyor of record, which was a title that carried some modest official weight and a steady income that contributed substantially to the household. The work suited him. He was outdoors and moving, working with his mind and his hands simultaneously, doing something that had real and lasting consequence for the people whose land he surveyed. He had not been this satisfied with his work since the early days in Kansas City, before the work had become routine. Autumn came, and with it the preparations for winter, and for a different February than any they had known before. Frank built an addition to the small front room, a proper second bedroom, snug and warm, with a wooden floor and a window that faced the sunrise. He built a cradle that took him 4 weeks, and that Bessie inspected with an engineer's eye and declared sound, which he took as the highest compliment. She sewed curtains for the new room from a bolt of yellow fabric that Clara Hale helped her choose, and the yellow room with its morning light became the most cheerful space in the house. Ruth Garza visited twice in the autumn and declared everything proceeding well. Bessie was strong and practical about her health in the same way she was practical about everything, eating well and working steadily but not straining herself, which was a negotiation between her natural work habits and her sensible judgment that Frank sometimes assisted with by appearing with a relevant alternative task whenever something looked too heavy. She caught him at this twice and told him with great affection and precision that she was pregnant and not made of glass. He said he was aware of both facts and was offering to carry things because he was nearby and it was convenient. She pointed out that he had appeared quite quickly from the other end of the yard. He said he was a fast walker. She looked at him for a moment and then laughed, and he carried the feed sacks anyway. They had, over the months of their marriage, developed the particular language of a couple that knows each other well, the shorthand of shared references and the domestic rhythms that run beneath words, the glances that carry full sentences, the silences that are as communicative as speech. They also argued, genuinely and sometimes heatedly, about things that mattered to them, and they had learned that the other could hold their ground without it meaning something was broken. Frank had argued with almost no one in Kansas City, having no relationships close enough to bother with honest disagreement. The fact that he argued with Bessie, and it was entirely fine, seemed to him one of the best things about being married to her. On a cold February morning in 1887, with snow on the ground and Ruth Garza already at the house, Bessie brought their son into the world with the same focused determination she brought to everything that required sustained effort and would not accept failure. Frank was in the room because he refused to be anywhere else, and Bessie had not told him to leave, which he took as consent. Ruth was calm and excellent, and had clearly done this in more difficult conditions than a warm house with a well-fed mother and a determined father. The boy arrived in the early morning, when the light was just beginning to come through the window of the main room, and he announced himself to the world with considerable force. Frank held him while Ruth attended to Bessie, and the small red face of his son looked up at him from under the blanket, and the baby's hand, impossibly small, wrapped around Frank's finger with a grip that was purely instinctive and completely total. He could not, in that moment, have constructed a sentence. Bessie looked at him from the bed, tired and bright-eyed and utterly herself. "Well," she said. "He is perfect," Frank said, and his voice came out unsteady in a way he did not try to manage. "Show me," she said. He brought the baby to her, and she received him with the natural sureness of someone who had thought carefully about how to hold a new person, and the baby settled against her and was quiet. "What shall we call him?" she said. They had discussed names in the autumn, circling candidates with the thoroughness of people who took naming seriously. They had agreed on one. "James Harold Whitfield," Frank said. The Harold was his father's name, which Frank had decided, after considerable private thought, was not the name's fault. His father had done at least one good thing. The land had made all of this possible. Bessie looked down at James Harold Whitfield, who was 11 minutes old and appeared satisfied with his circumstances for the moment. "Hello, James," she said, in a voice he had never heard her use before, quiet and enormous, the voice of a woman whose life had just expanded by a dimension she had not known was possible. Ruth Garza stayed for the morning and left after midday with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has done important work well. Frank cooked supper, which was not precisely elegant but was honest and hot, and brought it to Bessie in bed, and she ate with the appetite of a woman who had been working very hard for the past 12 hours. James slept in his cradle in the yellow room, which they had moved temporarily to the main room for warmth, and the sound of his breathing was the smallest and most complete sound Frank had ever heard. That evening, after Bessie was asleep and James was asleep, and the house was settled into its night quiet, Frank sat by the fire alone for a while. He thought about the letter from the land office that had arrived 14 months ago, the one that had pulled him out of his comfortable life in Kansas City and sent him across 3 days of hard riding to a town he had never visited to settle the affairs of a man he had spent years trying to forget. He thought about riding through the gate of the Northeast property and seeing a woman on the porch with her arms crossed and her eyes already on him, ready for the worst. He thought about the rocking chairs and the coffee and the long walk around the fence lines and the meadow above the property, with the mountains going purple in the afternoon haze. He thought about how close he had come to simply signing the papers in town and riding home. He sat for a long time with that thought, which was not exactly comfortable but was entirely real. The way the best kind of gratitude is not casual, not pretty, but profound in the bone. In the morning, he woke to the sound of James announcing breakfast requirements and Bessie's voice, warm and laughing, already at the cradle, and the smell of coffee beginning on the wood stove, and the winter light coming through the window of the room that she had built and that they had made into a home, and Frank Whitfield got up to begin the day. The years that followed were the years of a life fully lived on land that had been earned. The farm grew as the years grew. The herd expanded to 15 cattle by 1889, a genuinely productive operation now, with a reputation for quality animals that brought buyers from as far as Santa Fe. The fields yielded well year after year, because Bessie understood her land in the way only a person who has worked it through every season for many years can understand it. And Frank's methodical attention to soil rotation and planting schedules complemented her knowledge with a precision that made the combined result stronger than either approach alone. Frank's survey work expanded in ways he had not entirely anticipated. The territory was formalizing rapidly in the late 1880s, with more settlers arriving and the railroad making transportation and commerce easier, and the constant process of legal documentation accelerating. He trained William, the young man who had been his survey rod holder, into a full partner, and together they handled the county's growing workload. He also took on consulting work for the county commissioner's office on land disputes, his combination of survey expertise and practical knowledge of the territory making him a useful mediator in the complicated arguments that arose between neighboring landowners about boundaries and water rights. Water rights were the most contested thing in New Mexico territory, had always been, and would remain so. Frank learned the law and the custom of it, learned the complex tradition of acequia management that the Spanish and Mexican communities had practiced for generations before American settlers arrived with their own frameworks, and he learned it with respect for the systems that had worked and a clear eye for the places where the written law and the human reality needed to be brought into alignment. He became, without quite planning it, a person that people on all sides of disputes trusted, because he was honest and he did not take sides outside of what the facts supported, and he treated everyone who came to him as someone whose stake was legitimate until proven otherwise. James grew from an infant into a sturdy, curious boy who followed both his parents through their respective work with the absorption of a child who has the good fortune to have interesting parents. By the time he was 3, he knew the name of every cattle animal on the property. By 5, he could explain in reasonable terms why you surveyed from a fixed point and what a benchmark was for. Bessie taught him to read from the same shelf of books that had kept her company through the long, solitary winters of her early years here, and he took to reading with her same voraciousness. Frank's sister Mary came to visit in the summer of 1888, 3 months pregnant with her second child and accompanied by her husband, a steady carpenter from Missouri named George, and they spent 2 weeks on the property with an appreciation that grew visibly with each day. Mary, who had Frank's same brown hair and a more expressive version of his careful manner, spent long hours with Bessie in the kitchen garden and the house and riding the property, and the 2 women found each other the way people do when they are both genuinely interested in the real version of the other person, without pretense and without competition. On the last evening of the visit, sitting on the expanded porch in the August warmth with the mountains going through their evening colors, Mary said to Frank very quietly, "She is extraordinary." "I know," Frank said, Father would have disapproved of her completely, Mary said. She is too capable and too certain of herself, and she does not care what people think. Yes, Frank said. That is meant as the highest possible compliment, Mary said. He looked at Bessie across the porch, where she was teaching James to count the stars as they appeared, her voice patient and clear in the warm evening. I know it is, he said. In the spring of 1889, their daughter came. They named her Clara, after the friend who had helped Bessie choose yellow curtains, which was the kind of naming that tells you everything important about what a person values. Clara arrived with less drama than James had, and with equally strong opinions about making herself known to the world, and she became from the first weeks a child of emphatic presence who made James seem by comparison like a very good-natured young man, which he was. The family of 4 settled into the house that had been built for one person and expanded by one set of hands, and the house contained them all with the particular rightness of a space that has been genuinely inhabited. Frank added another room in the summer of 1889, a proper second bedroom for the children, built with the care he brought to all building work, better than the cradle if still entirely made of love. James took the new room with his sister as a matter of settled logic, because it was larger, and the arrangement held through their childhoods with the ordinary warfare and alliance of siblings who share a space and a family and would not, in the end, have it any other way. There were hard years. 1890 brought a drought that cut the wheat yield nearly in half and stressed the cattle in the late summer. They managed it together with the combined competence of 2 people who had both known hardship and did not panic in the face of it, drawing carefully on their root cellar stores and their careful reserves, and the network of neighbors and community members who traded help and goods without obligation through difficult seasons. Calico Flats weathered the drought as it had weathered the things before it, because frontier communities understood at a bone level that weathering hard things was what they were for. 1891 brought a dispute with a new landowner northeast of the Whitfield Brenner property, a man named Curtis who had come from Ohio with money and had purchased land by filing a claim on acreage that overlapped with a traditional grazing right held by 2 Mexican families who had been running cattle on that land since before the American Land Office existed. Frank spent a long autumn working through the documentation, working with the county commissioner and an attorney from Santa Fe, arguing clearly and at length for the recognition of the prior use rights. He won the argument, which meant the families kept their grazing access, and Curtis was not pleased, which Frank had the satisfaction of not caring about at all. Bessie was proud of him for that in a way she expressed by saying, over supper while the children were at the table, "You did the right thing." Coming from Bessie Brenner Whitfield, who understood the right thing in this territory from inside and from the bone, that was the exact weight it deserved, and Frank received it accordingly. By 1892, the property they ran was one of the most productive small farming and cattle operations in the county, known for the quality of its grain and the hardiness of its stock and the reliability of its ownership. Bessie had become a trusted figure in the farming community around Calico Flats, her 10-plus years of experience on this land, a resource that newer settlers regularly consulted, and she gave her knowledge without charge and without condescension, the way someone gives what they have earned when they understand that the community holding up is the only thing that makes individual holding up possible. Frank was the county surveyor of record, a position that came with a small official salary and a great deal of respect and the ongoing satisfaction of useful work. He and William had trained a 3rd young man by now, and the survey operation had taken on enough institutional character to continue even when Frank was attending to the farm or the family, which was the kind of organization that allows a person to have more than one thing they care about and not have to choose between them. James turned 8 in 1895, a serious-minded boy with Bessie's red hair and Frank's measuring gaze, and a combination of both their temperaments that produced a child who would sit very still in the presence of something interesting, and then ask precisely the question that went to the center of it. Clara was 6, and all the things James was quiet about, Clara was loud about, which created a household that was always interesting and never particularly restful, which both their parents found, secretly, exactly right. On a September evening in 1895, Frank and Bessie sat on the porch together as they had sat on the evening of the very first day, in the same 2 rocking chairs now worn with years of use, with the mountains going through their long orange sunset, and the children's voices audible from inside the house where they were doing their evening reading. The cattle were in the pasture. The harvest was in the cellar. The wheat had come up good this year and the corn better still. The survey contract for the following year was settled. The fence line was all in good order. 10 years since I rode through that gate, Frank said. Bessie was quiet for a moment. You looked like a man who wished he were somewhere else, she said. I looked like a man who was about to find out where he was supposed to be, he said. She turned her head to look at him in the evening light. She was 40 years old, and the years had given her more of themselves. The lines at the corners of her eyes from decades of squinting at the horizon, the silver that had come into her hair early as it did with redheads, the deepened capability of someone who has grown into the full measure of what they are. She was more herself than she had been when he first saw her standing on this porch with her arms crossed, and she had been already remarkably herself then. I told myself when I heard you were coming, she said, that I was not going to hope, that I had survived everything else without depending on hope, and I was not going to start then. And he said, and I hoped anyway, she said. The second day, when you came back. He reached over and took her hand the way he had in a dozen different postures and circumstances over the years, and she held it the way she always did, firmly, without performance, the way she held everything she chose to keep. I came back, he said. You came back, she said. Inside the house, James said something to Clara in the careful, older sibling tone of someone who is attempting patience, and Clara responded with the confident dismissiveness of someone who has never found patience particularly necessary. And Frank and Bessie looked at each other, and both of them were smiling. The mountains were going purple and then blue, and the first stars were appearing in the enormous sky above the territory. And the lamplight was beginning to show through the window of the house she had built, and he had helped to build further, and that together they had filled with 10 years of marriage and children and work, and the kind of love that is not a single moment, but an accumulation of 1,000 small moments of choosing each other in the ordinary light of daily life. The night came down soft and complete over the 40 acres northeast of Calico Flats, and the Whitfield family and their land settled into its keeping. And out over the territory, the coyotes had their conversation with the dark, and the windmill turned in a slow night wind, and the house held its warmth against the September air with the solidity of a thing that has been well and honestly built to last. Frank Whitfield had come west to settle a piece of business. He had settled instead into a life, and it was the best possible kind, made of real things, held by real hands, built on ground that had been earned and loved and was still, every season, growing.